are things in life you just get comfortable with, even without an explanation. You just accept them, and you even come to expect them. You stop to think about it every now and then, but you eventually stop trying. For me, that thing has always been around for about as long as I can remember. I've walked through life with a very strange companion. My grandfather died in the fall of 1931. It wasn't tragic, it was just his time. He survived until he became senile. His life was already over as far as I was concerned. I was sad to see him go, just as any other little boy would be. But I knew he wasn't my grandfather anymore. He just wasn't there. He was gone. So I didn't cry at his funeral. I'd done plenty of crying the first time that he'd forgotten my name. I just said my goodbyes and washed my hands of it. I did a lot of remembering, though. I remember all the things about him that mattered to me. I remembered all the quarters that he pulled from behind my ear, and all the walks in the park, and all the little games of catch he'd play before he started complaining about his back pain. I especially remember his stories. He had a million of them, most of them far-fetched and funny, and punctuated with his own laughter. We all liked to listen to him ramble on and on and on, and that was plenty for him. The stories I recall most, though, weren't the silly little anecdotes. In fact, they weren't even really stories. Not really. They were more like obscure references, the kind you might hear about La Llorona, the Tooth Fairy, or the Boogeyman. The ones I grew up with were about the owl. There's a difference between the owl and those other creatures, though. All the other stories you'd hear, they're urban legends, because there's always a story behind them. Not the owl. Grandpa never told us what the owl was, where it came from, what it did. The owl was just the owl. And the references were never consistent either. We didn't know if we were supposed to fear it or feel safe because of it. One night he'd tell us not to be afraid of monsters under the bed because the owl would keep them away. And another day he'd tell us not to tell fibs or eat candy before dinner because the owl was watching. My older brother, Jeffrey, stopped believing the owl after Grandpa died. I believed, though. I'd always believed, and I knew for sure after the wake. Everyone took turns walking by his open casket to say their final goodbyes, commenting on how peaceful he looked. And then, it was my turn. I was only 9 years old, so I had to stand on my toes to see. The first thing I saw was my grandfather's face, expressionless and pale, and it choked me up the way you'd expect it to. It was also my first experience with death. I was very disturbed, too disturbed to look for very long. Then I saw something that no one else seemed to notice. If they did, they didn't make any mention of it. It was tucked away discreetly, protruding maybe an inch or two from his jacket, just enough to grab my attention. It was a feather. It was long, beautiful, pure silver white with faint stripes of gray along the vein. It seemed so deliberately placed, but I hadn't seen anyone else put it there, and I'd been very nervously watching the line move ahead of me the entire time. I almost reached for it, but I knew that wouldn't be proper. For a moment, I forgot about my grandfather. The feather was all I could see, and I felt numb. Nobody else saw it. Nobody else would believe me if I told them, but I knew. I knew where it came from. It belonged to the owl. That night was restless. It was a long time before I could sleep comfortably again, because that was the night when it first paid me a visit. In the moonlight, I could just make it out. It was perched on a tree branch just outside my bedroom window. A large, great horned owl, entirely silver. Even its beak and talons were sort of dull gray. I couldn't see its eyes. They were sunken into dark hollows. It didn't make the fidgety gestures you'd expect from a bird. It never moved an inch, never made a sound, and it never looked away. It stared through my window, directly at me, the entire night. I've seen it outside my window every night since. Sometimes it's on my windowsill where I can see its every feather. Sometimes across the street in a neighboring tree, but always where I can see it. It was there the first night I spent in my first apartment, in downtown Los Angeles, far from where anyone would expect to see such a bird. It was there the night my wife gave birth to our first son, and I caught a glimpse of it from the corner of my eye, staring at me from the waiting room small window. Once I was hospitalized overnight with a terrible flu. The room had no windows, but I knew the owl was watching. I could feel it. It's always been there, waiting, patiently. Waiting for what? I don't know. Truth be told, I still don't know. It never moved, and it never looked away. In the later years of my life, I think I began to understand my late grandfather a little better. I understood why he told us those stories, why he tried to make us believe in the owl. I found myself doing the same for my own grandchildren. He must have believed, just as I had, that he wouldn't have to feel so alone if someone else knew. The thing about being haunted is that you adjust to it, but you never really get used to it. Does that make any sense? Things wouldn't seem quite right if it wasn't there, as usual, but it's always nagging at you in the back of your mind. You can never ignore it, even if you wanted to. So instead, you try to live with it. For a while, I even tried to interact with it. Tried to understand the thing, or just see it do something, anything, other than just sit there in silence and stare at me. I would often approach the window and open it, but it always fluttered away in the shadows before I got too close. Not for long, though. It would always return once I gave it an acceptable amount of space. Sometimes I would place a chair across from the window. At the distance the owl light, I would sit in that chair and talk to the bird, telling it about my day, my troubles, my dreams. I'd hope the owl was listening, or maybe that it would respond somehow. It never did. It just sat perfectly still, as always, watching me patiently. The owl's been my strange companion. It's never left me, no matter how much I wished it would. Since I became ill, its behavior has changed. It has begun to move, an anxious little shuffle, and it tilts its head from time to time in that impossible way unique to owls. I can see its eyes now, dull amber beads and pupils wide with anticipation. I think I've even seen it smiling, if you can imagine an owl's lipless version of a smile. I don't imagine what it means, though. I think I can guess. I can see it outside my window even as I write this down. I sat down at this table to go over my last will and testament one more time, or maybe write a few letters before I lose the chance. Instead, I chose to write about the owl. I just want someone, even if only one person, to know how I've been haunted all this time. In the end, I have only one question on my mind. Will someone find the feather in my casket too? I hope it isn't my grandson. I hope he didn't believe my stories, now that I can see what the owl really is. Now that I